It is my great pleasure today to welcome James Archibald, whose reputation precedes him, as part of our project to interview English-speaking Quebecers from across the spectrum. Thank you very much, Mr. Archibald, for agreeing to participate in our project.
It's a pleasure.
Now, I'd like to start off, as I do with all of our interviewees, with a few questions for context about your background. So if we could begin by me asking you, where were your parents born?
My parents were born in the United States.
Mhm. And where were you born?
I was born in the United States as well.
Okay. And where did you receive your education, your elementary, secondary, and any post-secondary?
I received my education at elementary and secondary levels in the United States. I went to Freiburg Academy in the west of Maine, right on the border of New Hampshire. And after I finished high school, I came to McGill University and I studied at McGill. And after that, I went to the University of Montreal. And after that, I went to France and I did all my graduate work at the University of Lille in France.
Very good. And what is your occupation?
I'm a professor.
Okay. And where do you live now?
I have a foot in two places, if you will. I live in Montreal. That's where we're speaking today. And I also live in Italy for part of the year because I teach at the University of Turin in the north of Italy.
Very good. Now, we're going to get to what I like to call the meat of the matter here. But before I do, there's a couple of things I want to make sure that we're clear on. Because this is for educational purposes, the questions and answers are the stars. So I will not be asking any follow-up questions. I want to be as unbiased as possible, nor will I be commenting on your responses in any way. Okay, just to be fair.
No problem.
Okay.
I'm happy to answer your questions anyway.
Okay, very good. All right, so having said that, we're going to continue with questions concerning your experience living in Quebec of today. I'll start off with the first question, which is, what is the best thing about living in Quebec?
I think that one of the things that strikes me, having lived in Quebec for quite a few years, is the fact that Quebec is really known for its cultural diversity. I'm always impressed by the creativity that one finds in Quebec, not only from a cultural point of view, but also from a business perspective, from a point of view of the administration of public affairs. And Quebec has always impressed me as being a place which looks very favorably upon cultural diversity. So for me, that's a very important piece of the puzzle.
Okay. Now, the next question, a lot of people have had trouble with, and certainly if it was posed to me, I would have trouble with it, but I'm going to ask you to respond to the question as posed, but you're free to elaborate on your response as much as you'd like. Having said that, I'll ask the question, describe your relationship to Quebec in a single word.
I obviously had to think about this before, and I had lots of choices, but the one that stuck in my mind at the end, after having thought about all of this, is the word transactional. Because the fact that most of my relationships in Quebec are related to transactions, whether it be through public authorities, whether it be through institutions, whether it be through a simple thing like the healthcare system. A lot of the relationships that I have are clearly transactional.
Okay, fair enough. Now, where do you feel most at home in Quebec? For example, in communities based on language, culture, profession, or geographic location?
I think based on my history, what I've done since I've been here, I feel that I'm probably most comfortable in professional context, in the sense that ever since I've been here, I've worked in the publishing business briefly. I've taught in universities. I taught at the University of Quebec and at McGill, obviously. And I've worked closely with the Quebec government under different political stripes. And I think that professional relationship has been the one which I feel probably most at home in.
Okay. Now, the next question, again, I'm going to preface it by saying a lot of people have had trouble with the second part. They've said, Dave, what do you mean by official definition in Quebec? Fair enough. And my response to that is what you perceive to be the official definition in Quebec, whether it be through the media, whether it's your peers, whether it's through work, or whether it's through various governments. So it's what you perceive the official definition in Quebec. So having said that, I'll ask the two-part question. How would you define a Quebecer? And do you think the official definition in Quebec includes you?
Let me give a slightly nuanced answer to that question. One is that if you look at the tax code, for instance, somebody who earns income here has a carte soleil, someone who benefits from government services, etc., qualifies as a Quebecer, in the sense that yes, you have a legal status here and you benefit from certain government services. So I think that's a reasonable thing to consider. The other thing is obviously the fact that under different governments in Quebec, they flirted with the idea of Quebec citizenship, and of course, you know, that poses certain questions with regard to nationality and the legality of the concept, etc. But most interestingly, just last year, yes, because we're in a new year already. Just last year, I gave a paper at a university in Morocco, and the subject of the paper was in fact the issue of citizenship. And in the paper, which I gave in French, I used the concept of citoyen de proximité. In other words, somebody who lives in a particular area. Now, the English translation is probably an alien resident, but in fact, in certain jurisdictions, people recognize the rights of people who are living in a particular geographic region without necessarily being citizens in the legal sense of the word. And the example which I used in the paper which I presented was the city of Cherbourg in the north of France, where they have a process whereby all people who are immigrants participate in activities in the city which are sponsored by the city and which are called, I'll use the French expression I used, ateliers de citoyens de proximité, workshops for alien residents, basically. And that includes everybody, the children, the adults, the guest workers, etc. So this concept of citizenship is really quite interesting from that point of view. And of course, as you may know, I've taken part in a number of activities with the City of Montreal, where we have published different versions of the Charter of Citizen Rights and Responsibilities. And if you look at the text of the Montreal Charter, the Montreal Charter uses the concept of citizen in the sense of someone who lives in a particular geographical context. And so the concept of citizenship is more geographical than it is legal from that point of view. Obviously, people who live in a certain area have certain rights, etc., certain human rights, which are general to all sorts of populations, etc. So, bottom line, to answer your question, is that it's a very complicated notion to deal with. And I think the Quebec government has tried to come up with official definitions in inverted commas through different pieces of draft legislation, etc. But I think that what is more important is to consider the de facto definition of what a citizenship is, what citizenship is. And I think that that involves responsibilities and that involves duties as far as governments are concerned with regard to people who are living in a particular territory, whether they benefit from the legal status of a citizenship as a passport holder. So I think you have to be relatively flexible in understanding that concept. Sorry for the long answer, but I think it's important to contextualize it.
Very good. Thank you for that. Now, has your sense of identity as a Quebecer changed over the years? And if so, in what ways?
I think that obviously as an immigrant, you start to learn how to function within a particular system. And I think that the one thing that has probably changed over the years, because it's been a few years, is the concept of conviviality. I think it's extremely important to underscore the fact that there is a certain convivial relationship with the people who live here and the people who come here from elsewhere. Since I work in Italy, one of the words that I love when you talk about this concept in Italy is convivencia in Italy, which means that the fact that you can live together with people and get on with them without having any source of major conflict. And I think that in Quebec, very often people use the expression vivre ensemble as a concept. And I think that's important because what I felt over the years is that there has been an effort on the part of friends and colleagues who are Québécois de souche, if you will, is this concept of conviviality. I think that's an extremely important piece of the puzzle if you try to figure it all out.
Now, what are some of the most difficult things about living in Quebec from your perspective?
Well, one of the things that has bothered me over a period of time, and I've written about this on several occasions, and I've shared my thoughts with the government as well, is the fact that from a structural point of view, the Quebec government has in fact created certain barriers. And I don't know if those barriers are really necessary. One can explain them from a sociological point of view, from a sociolinguistic point of view, etc. But one of the things that is always stuck in my craw, so to speak, is the fact that successive Quebec governments have created a category that they've referred to as cultural communities, communauté culturelle. And in fact, at one point in time, the Ministry of Immigration, or the Department of Immigration for the Quebec government, was called the Ministry of Immigration and Cultural Communities. So that from a legal point of view, what that meant was that in the mindset of those who were charged with the governance of the province of Quebec, that they created a category of citizens, go back to the definition that I gave of citizens before, which sets them apart from everybody else. And so by virtue of the fact that this concept of cultural communities exists, it is a way of erecting a sort of barrier between the general population and others. And if you go through a lot of Quebec government documents, there's the distinction between who is qualified as nous, as us, and who is qualified as les autres, the others. And that is not helpful in trying to build a cohesive society. So to give you a concrete example of that, in the professional system in Quebec, for instance, one of the things that the government tries to do is to ensure that the members of the public who represent the public on the different boards of the different professional bodies in Quebec, such as the College of Physicians or the Order of Accountants or whatever have you. They want to make sure that the people who sit on those boards who represent the public interest come from different parts of Quebec society. And they actually measure the number of people who represent, quote, cultural communities on those boards. So the intent is probably positive, but the effect is somewhat different in the fact that the Quebec government, no matter what political stripe we're dealing with, recognizes the difference. And to my mind, that's problematic. It may be that I was trained in France, and I look at the fact that the country basically is very opposed to this sort of communitarian view of society. That, you know, if you're a French resident, you're a French resident, period. If you're a French citizen, you're a French citizen, period. Don't care where you come from, what language you speak, what religion you are, what accent you have, doesn't make any difference, etc. So the Quebec government has clearly, over the years, since the whole concept of cultural communities came into play, has reinforced this sort of quasi-legal definition of other people who are not part of the major fabric of society. And to my mind, that's dysfunctional, and it doesn't really help build a more cohesive society. That's my most political comment that I will get out of it.
Well, the next question delves a little further into what you were alluding to, and you probably have responded in some of the other questions. Your responses have probably included some of potentially your response to the next question, but I'll ask it anyway for the record. In recent years, some members of Quebec's Francophone majority have identified a number of linguistic and cultural threats. Which of these concerns do you share and support, and which of these concerns make you feel excluded or targeted?
I take issue with your question. Okay. I don't like the word threat, okay. Because I don't think that even within the context as it may be perceived by some people in the non-Francophone world, I think that the proper issue to deal with is what are the challenges that are out there. And in fact, if you look in the French-speaking milieu, the term which comes up very often instead of threat or the equivalent in French would be des enjeux. These are things that we have, these are issues that we have to deal with. And, you know, no matter what the political stripe is of the people who are in power, these issues don't change that much. And I think it's important to look at it from that point of view. Maybe it's sort of naive on my part, I don't know, but I like to look at politics as something which is positive which can bring about positive change. And so, to my mind, it's more important not to look at the threats, even though you may disagree with certain aspects with regard to the school system, with regard to language legislation or whatever. But these are challenges that the society has to face in general. And I think we can face these challenges together. I don't think we have to break it down into opposing groups that are, battling one against the other from that point of view. But I think that, to follow up on my previous comment, I think that we have to avoid these restrictive categories that are built into the sociolinguistic and sociological system in Quebec. Example, for instance, when the current Premier of Quebec reacts negatively to the fact that, as he sees it, systemic racism doesn't exist. De facto, it does exist. But you have to recognize that is a challenge in society. So how do you deal with hatred? How do you deal with racism? How do you deal with prejudice, etc.? And so, as a society, people have to look at this from a collective point of view and say, how do we address these issues from a positive point of view? And so, I think that the attitude on the part of the current, at least the current premier, is denial of the fact that this exists from a sociological point of view. It's there. You can't turn a blind eye to it. We just finished with Black History Month, and you can't run away from the facts. The facts are there. We just finished looking at a report, for instance, about the policing system in the city of Montreal, in Quebec. So I mean, these are facts. It's reality. So whether you like it or not, you have to deal with these challenges, and I think that's important. And so I think we have to move away from all of these restrictive categories that have sort of infiltrated the political system from that point of view. And we have to move more toward an open society where people feel comfortable in this vivre ensemble concept, in this living together, convivencia. As I said before. And so I think that what is important is that we have to build a society which is more open, which is more accepting, which is, and I like the French term which describes that better, and the fact that we have to live in a society which is décloisonné. It has to be opened up. We have to, force the doors open. And I think that's extremely important. And in fact, when you look at the history of the Charter of Rights and Responsibilities, which the City of Montreal has put out, that is one of the concepts behind it, which is totally compatible with the United Nations view of human rights and responsibilities. And the fact that in the City of Montreal, we published the Charter of Rights and Responsibilities in several languages. And those languages were chosen from a socio-demographic point of view, saying, okay, what are the groups which we want to reach out to, and we want to have them understand that they're part of the fabric of the city. And so, the first version that was done in another language was the Spanish language version. And there's a large Hispanic community in Montreal. If I can just add one anecdote, just yesterday, I took an Uber coming back from an appointment, and I walked out of the building where I was and got into the Uber. And as I opened the door and got in, usually the answer from an Uber driver is, "Are you so-and-so?" Just to make sure that you've got the right person in the car. And as I opened the door and I got into the car, the Uber driver turns around, looks at me, and says, "Buenos dias, señor." And I was taken aback. I said, so I asked him in Spanish. I said, why are you speaking to me in Spanish? He said, because before you got in the car, I looked up your profile and I know that you can speak Spanish. And the Uber driver was a new immigrant from Colombia. And he speaks neither English nor French. And he was very happy to know that his passenger could speak Spanish. So we had a very long conversation in Spanish in the Uber driver's car, etc. So that's sort of an anecdotal sample of what life can be. Obviously, all Montrealers aren't polyglots, and they can't react to every situation. But we went down the list when we decided this, and it was with Mayor Tremblay that we initially started this project. The next languages that we looked at were Arabic and others. You can go on the Montreal website and see which ones we did, including Italian, of course. And then the one that got us into a bit of trouble was the one that we did in Chinese. And of course, we had a choice between Mandarin and Cantonese. And we had a choice between traditional characters and modern characters. And in the city of Montreal, we always bounce this off the consular group in the city before we actually publish the text. So we bounced the first version that we did in Chinese of the charter off the consul of the People's Republic in Montreal, and came back, said we're very upset because A, we'd used traditional characters, and B, the text was in Cantonese. And so we had to come back and we had to do two versions, one in traditional characters and one in modern characters, one in Mandarin and one in Cantonese. And why? Because there were two waves of immigration from China into Montreal. And China is on the front page of discussion today for security reasons, but there are two waves of immigration. The old wave of immigration spoke Cantonese, and the new wave is coming from the new China. So it was two different worlds, etc. Then the other problem, I'm sorry to belabor this issue, but I think it's very important from a cultural point of view, is that the other issue, and this came up in our discussion when we did the Italian version, was that the city of Montreal in doing the versions where you're dealing with a gendered language, English is not so difficult from that point of view because it's basically a non-gendered language. But in gendered language, it poses a problem because the city of Montreal, the official text being in French, always use the word citizen, citoyen, but they put the feminine before the masculine. So when you look at an article in it, it was citoyenne et citoyen, because they wanted to make sure that women's rights were respected and that women citizens had the exact same rights as male citizens. And that was linguistically speaking, that was their way of reinforcing that particular perspective. But when it came to doing the text in languages like Italian, the group that I worked with on the Italian version was very upset because it was grammatically, it made the text very heavy to do this, since they said it would be much more elegant to avoid this problem. But the people in Montreal wanted absolutely to insist on that. That's nothing compared to when we did the Arabic translation and the Hebrew translation of the charter, because the fact that not only those languages are gendered languages, but the verbs are gendered and the adjectives are gendered and the whole structure of the language is gendered. And so it made it an extremely complicated exercise to do that and to respect the political orientation if they wanted. Anyway, we did it, and that's it. And so that was one of the things that sort of, I think, illustrates to my mind this idea of building a society which is more inclusive, which reach out to different people, and by eliminating these barriers. Sorry for the long answer to your question.
Not at all. It's better to be comprehensive than not. Now, again, some of these questions that I pose are very general in nature, and you've alluded to the response in some of the other questions I've posed, but I'm going to ask it anyway for the record. What is the biggest problem facing Quebec, and how, in your mind, do you think it could be resolved?
The biggest problem facing Quebec. Right today, I think it's the socioeconomic issues that have really got to be upfront. From a cultural point of view, obviously people in the English-speaking world in Quebec maybe see things through a certain colored lens, but I think that, brush that aside, people have to be able to eat, they have to be able to feed their families, they have to put a roof over their heads. And so those socioeconomic issues are really, really important. And I think that some of these other concerns have to take a back seat to that, to make sure that people can actually live in decent conditions. And especially if we're talking about immigrant communities that come into a place, they have to be able to have access to healthcare. They have to be living in a secure environment where they don't feel threatened. They have to have access to proper housing. They have to have access to jobs, etc. And the laundry list goes on. And so, there's a certain cultural overlay that goes with that. But really, the crux of the matter is the socioeconomic issue.
Okay, fair enough. Now, I'm going to preface the next question by asking you, we're going to pause for a moment, asking you if you have had the opportunity to see the great documentary, What We Choose to Remember. Have you seen that?
To be honest, I don't think so, no.
Okay. I'll explain why I mentioned this. It's leading up to the next question. It's a documentary produced, directed, and written by a gentleman by the name of Guy Rogers, who happens to be a very good friend of mine, well-known Anglophone film director here in Quebec. He created this documentary through, it started out through a series of interviews like I'm doing here, and then it became much bigger. He saw some common themes and developed it into a documentary. And it's called What We Choose to Remember. It's the history of Quebec, specifically English Quebec, although he does allude to other cultures in it, through the lens of waves of immigration from the Plains of Abraham right through to the 21st century. And he produced or created the documentary as a reflection on the 50th anniversary of the October crisis in Quebec. It's a very interesting piece of work. I highly recommend that you see it. In fact, what I can do for you, if you're interested, and I do with a lot of people who haven't seen it, there is a link where you can watch it on any device that you choose, be it your computer or if your TV's hooked up to the internet or whatever device you want. I'll send you the link. It's free of charge, and you can watch the documentary. It's a little over an hour. It's very well put together. It's very fairly, from my perspective anyway, presented. And it really gives an interesting perspective, because you were talking about immigration and so on before. I thought it might be an interesting perspective for you to check out. So the reason I bring that up is, in that documentary, he used a very interesting visual tool which was a show of fingers. So I'm going to ask you to indicate by a show of fingers, and I do have permission from Guy Rogers to use this tool, visual tool, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being weakest, 10 being strongest. How strongly do you feel that the joys of living in Quebec outweigh the challenges?
Got that?
Yeah, very good. That's excellent. Thank you. Now, I'm going to give you an opportunity to say anything else about your sense of identity and belonging in Quebec. It's a completely open question. You can say anything you like.
I think that the most important thing is for us to move forward and to build a sense of security within a community. Security has many different meanings. And also to build a sense of inclusiveness, to have a society which is inclusive. That's hard to do given some of the political tensions that exist within Quebec. But I think that if we look at, maybe if we could form a sort of national union government, etc., that would be the direction we should move in, clearly, is to accentuate the inclusiveness, because there's a lot of goodwill, despite the political tensions that might exist within the society. There's a lot of goodwill out there to move forward. And just a couple of reflections that, from a personal point of view, that I share with you, is that when the government during the last sitting of the legislature in Quebec put forward this new law, which basically changed the charter of the French language, it changed things not only from the point of view of the legislative framework that we're dealing with, because don't forget, we're dealing with framework legislation, which gives a lot of room for maneuvering from a regulatory point of view within the government. And one of the changes that was made from an institutional point of view was to change the landscape of the institutions responsible for language policy within Quebec. So heretofore, Quebec had the Office québécois de la langue française, which was instituted a little over 40 years ago. And it also had another institution called the Commission de Toponymie, which decided on place names for Quebec. Sounds like a sort of a minor issue, but it's important because it has important impact as far as identity is concerned. And the previous charter also had another institution, which was the Conseil supérieur de la langue française, which was a consultative body, which was supposed to advise the minister responsible for the French language on language policy. And it conducted a certain amount of research dealing with language issues. For instance, the language of aviation, integration of students in the school system, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the important parts of that was the actual consultative part of the Conseil supérieur. And I know of what I speak because I was a member of the Conseil, is that the government had the possibility of consulting the Conseil with regard to language policy. And the Conseil had the role also of advising the minister responsible for language policy. And so when the current ComECh government proposed Bill 96, one of the first things that the members of the Conseil said to the government was, consult us. We have lots of experience in this area, and we have lots of things that we would like to share with you with regard to that. The minister responsible, whose name is Jean Barrette, did not consult the Conseil. The Conseil invited him to meet with the Conseil to discuss the draft legislation. He declined the invitation. And one of the articles in the new law, 96, basically eliminated the Conseil. So the Conseil was eliminated without any consultation whatsoever, even though that was offered. So the reason I'm giving you this example is that, to my mind, it's an example of sort of the authoritarian nature of government under this particular political party. And I think it's a concern. It's especially of concern because the fact that they have a crushing majority in the National Assembly. And if you look back over the 2+ years that we lived through this pandemic with COVID, they became used to operating by decree. And the opposition parties, not that they are at fault really, but the opposition parties were not effective in their role as the loyal opposition in a parliamentary democracy. And the government got away with a lot of things during that period simply because of the fact that there was no effective opposition. They were basically toothless tigers. And the government in power was able to act in an authoritative fashion without the normal checks and balances. And so that was disquieting. So that's one of the things that I think one has to look at as a challenge the future. We're looking to future governments, is to how do we build a sense of inclusion, a sense of participation in society when you have a government which tends to be authoritative, which tends to use its ability to rule essentially by decree. And to my mind, that is not particularly democratic. Unfortunately, the Westminster system, the parliamentary system that we live in, that's one of the downsides of that system when you have a very large majority government, which can rule this way. But I think that it is in the interest of the government in situations like that to, in fact, be more open, to be more consultative, to move more toward making sure that those who might feel disenfranchised are actually enfranchised. And to my mind, it's a major challenge in building an open society, a more inclusive society, where people feel that there's a greater deal of allegiance to the social fabric. And if we don't succeed in doing that, I think it's a major concern as far as the future is concerned. So that's a sort of long-winded answer to your final question, but that's where I have a certain feeling of angst.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for your participation and your observations. Everybody's story is unique. Everybody's perspective is valid, and I thank you for yours. I'm going to stop the recording, but I'd like to speak to you afterwards if you don't mind.
No problem.